Hello, my name is Pamela Anderson. We're in the chapel in Greenfield Village. A little side note about myself, this is my 31st year as a presenter, historical presenter. And I also presented in here in the chapel when I went to school here. We recited poetry twice a year. I'm painfully shy, but I managed to get through it. It's a wonderful school, K through 6, from 55 to 62, as Ford had designed his educational system. We're going to introduce 3 wonderful speakers in a panel discussion. First of all, we have Bob Casey, retired curator of transportation at the Henry Ford. Then we have David Schultz, automotive historian and Lincoln expert. And then Matt Short, automotive historian and Packard expert. Thank you for listening and enjoy all 3 speakers in this panel discussion.
Thank you, Pam. As Pam said, I'm Bob Casey. I'm the retired curator here, curator of transportation, retired 10 years, which hardly seems possible now. Before going further, I want to thank the Margaret Dunning Foundation for the grant that made this panel possible. Margaret was a longtime resident of Plymouth, Michigan, whose foundation does really very good work in Southeast Michigan. And Margaret Dunning was a grand lady who lived to age 104 and could still drive her 1930 Packard Roadster. So, thank you, Margaret. We're going to talk today about American luxury cars from the 1930s era and earlier, and I've got 2 people here with me who know a lot about those cars. On my right is Dave Schultz. He's been a vintage auto enthusiast and historian for more than 60 years. He has personal experience with locomobiles and Cords and Pierce Arrows and Packards and especially Lincolns. He's president of the Lincoln Owners Club, a past president of the Classic Car Club of America. He's judged at Pebble Beach. He's been the chief judge at the Amelia Island Concours, and he was the executive director of the Glenmore Gathering. He writes column for Hemmings Classic Car, and he's contributed articles to several other magazines. Matt Short started his career actually as an intern here at the Henry Ford, and he's worked at the R.E. Olds Museum in Lansing, at America's Packard Museum. He's been the curator and executive vice president at the Auburn Duesenberg Museum. He's presently an account executive with a museum exhibit company called Exhibit Concepts. And with them, he's worked on projects at the early Ford V8 Museum, the National Corvette Museum, the Classic Car Club Museum, and a number of others. He's always loved cars of the classic era, especially Packards. He's owned 9 Packards, and there's always room to own 1 more. We're going to be talking about luxury cars. Interesting enough, there's no generally accepted definition of what is a luxury car on which everybody agrees. I think the closest thing to such a definition comes from the Classic Car Club of America for their criteria for what they call full classics. So to get us started, I'm going to turn it over to Dave, who's going to talk about Lincolns, but first maybe have a couple of words about the Classic Car Club's definition of a classic car.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. The Classic Car Club of America provides a pretty straightforward definition of a classic car, and they simply state that they were American or foreign automobiles that were noted for their superior engineering, their superior construction, and their superior design. And they have a long list of cars that fulfill those criteria. But essentially, it was design, construction, and engineering. And you can pretty much figure out for yourself what's a classic. It's like one of our Chief Justices said years ago, you know, I kind of paraphrase him, I can tell a classic car when I see it, and you're generally correct. I've been asked to talk about one of the great classics, and that was the Lincoln. Lincoln was recognized for its centennial this year by Ford Motor Company. At least they recognized the centennial of Ford buying Lincoln in February of 1922. The company was actually founded in 1920 to make automobiles. And I say to make automobiles because the company was actually founded in 1917 as the Lincoln Motor Company to make engines for World War I, the famous Liberty engines. Henry Leland and his son Wilfred left General Motors, formed the Lincoln Motor Company out of patriotism to make those motors. The war ended. They had a huge plant on Warren and Livernois, and investors came to Henry Leland and said, let's make another automobile. And by another, I mean that they previously had made the Cadillac. So Leland went from the Cadillac to a brand new car in 1920, named after the first president he voted for, Abraham Lincoln, which tells you how old Mr. Leland was in 1920. He had voted for Lincoln in 1864. So in 1920, they launched a new automobile, the Lincoln, and the company was successful to the extent that it was well received as a superior American luxury car. However, it was introduced at a very bad financial time in America, the post-war recession. And it was hurt by the post-war recession. Any luxury car, including Locomobile, Packard, everyone was hit by that. And in addition, most companies at that time had pretty stodgy styling, so this kind of a perfect storm forced Lincoln into bankruptcy. And in February of 1922, the company was purchased by Henry Ford and his son Edsel for $8 million, which was considerably under the value of the company, but at an auction sale at bankruptcy, you get what you can get. And what the Fords got was a superb automobile factory and a superb automobile. And it immediately became Edsel Ford's priority. Edsel Ford was not that interested in the Model T, and so Edsel's focus was on upgrading the Lincoln. This is an ad for the Lincoln while it was still owned by the Leland Company, the Leland family. And you can see that the emphasis is on Leland built. Henry Leland was known within the automobile industry for his accuracy in engineering, and he was actually known as the master of precision. He had spearheaded interchangeable parts back in the early days of the 20th century, and he carried that tradition into Lincoln. Ford took over in 1922, bought the inventory that was on the floor, and then set out to make a new car. They did not change the chassis. The Lelands had designed a superb chassis. What Edsel Ford focused on was body styling. The styling had come into its own by the 1920s, and that was Edsel Ford's wheelhouse. You can see here a number of the different body styles that were being offered, and simply stated, the cars just became more attractive as the years went on. And Edsel's formula, since there was no inside design for house at Ford, Edsel worked with custom coach builders such as Willoughby, Judkins, LeBaron, and others to design the Lincoln bodies. By 1927, when Calvin Coolidge was president, Lincoln was the car of choice. Other presidents had earlier had other automobiles, but Lincoln had such prestige by that time that Calvin Coolidge used Lincoln for his professional appearances, and also privately owned a beautiful Lincoln Phaeton, which still exists. One of the ways that Edsel Ford elevated the status of the Lincoln was not just through body redesign, but through what we would today call promotion and marketing. He created some of the most beautiful automobile literature that you'll see in the 1920s, including a magazine that was actually sent to owners and prospective owners that talked about the virtues of the Lincoln motor car, and simply made you aspire to want to own a Lincoln. This is a typical catalog. This one used the theme of the evolution of transportation and contained about 7 or 8 different body styles that were inspired by different eras in history, like the Egyptian era, the Roman era, the colonial era. And you can see here the influence of that on these cars, especially the interiors. And these cars were taken to not just the automobile shows, but more significantly, they were taken to salons, which were invitation only. And if you were invited to the salon, you had a certain amount of status, but more important, you had deep pockets. And you could afford cars that typically shown at the salon would start at probably a minimum of $4,000, $5,000 up into the higher numbers, custom-built cars. Their catalogs, as you can see, were beautifully done. This is from 1930, and this was created specifically for the salon. Again, showing all the custom bodies that were available. And when we say custom, we don't mean just deciding to have mirrors or having chrome spokes or things like that. They were literally built to the customer's specifications, with interiors, with features that customers could dream up. I once had a Lincoln where it had front and back seats, and all the seats had different thicknesses of cushions, depending on the owner's taste. So again, when you're spending between $4,500 and $10,000 on a car, you got what you wanted. This is a typical catalog from 1931. I happen to own a 1931 Lincoln Phaeton, and this is what I would have read in the catalog about that car when I went into the showroom. I also have a confidential salesman's handbook that they use for walking you around the car and talking about the virtues of the car. And you'd be hard-pressed to find a car that was not at the standards of Lincoln. Lincoln excelled in over-design and overbuilt. Obviously, a car with that kind of price tag attracted a lot of industrialists, a lot of business people, most of whom we don't know today, but they were also purchased by celebrities and who wanted a nice car. And there you see W.C. Fields, the comedian, with his 1933 Lincoln LeBaron convertible roadster. And that car, by the way, is still at the Lincoln Museum over in Hickory Corners, Michigan, north of Kalamazoo, on display. It's on loan from its owner. But these were just truly unique automobiles, again, built to the owner's taste. Here we see a typical advertisement for Lincoln from the 1930s, late 1930s, and this is coming to the end of an era. And by that I mean that the classic car era as we define it really existed between 1915 and I would argue 1942, but the club goes up to 48, and that's another story. But essentially, the classic era ended because the coach building companies slowly went out of business. The revenue simply wasn't there to support coach building companies. And Lincoln, by this time, was building less than 1,000 cars a year, close to probably 700. And that was spread over about 22 body styles. So you can imagine if this was a privately owned company, it would have shut its doors. It didn't shut its doors because it was subsidized by the Ford Motor Company, and that's what kept them open. But by this time, Edsel Ford, who was president of Lincoln, knew that the end was coming, and so he took a look at the market and said, what we really need is a car that costs less but has something special going for it. And that car became the Lincoln Zephyr. The Lincoln Zephyr sold for a third of what the big Lincoln sold for. It had 12 cylinders, albeit a very, very small 12-cylinder engine, more like a Ford V8 with 4 more cylinders. But it was 12 cylinders. It had breakthrough styling. Probably the first really successful streamlined car in America. And that car carried on the Lincoln name when they made the last big Lincoln in 1939. An interesting story, maybe apocryphal, was Edsel Ford was asked by a business writer why Lincoln had stopped building the big Lincoln. And Edsel Ford's reply was, "We didn't stop building them, people stopped buying them." And so a car that sold for $4,600 just wasn't practical anymore, $4,600 base price. The Zephyr was in about the $1,700 range, and they sold lots of them. And the last big bang I think for Edsel and for the Lincoln Company pre-war came with this. What happened?
You hit the wrong button.
Hit the wrong button. There's the right button. It's a story of my life. I hit the wrong buttons. There's what the Zephyr looked like. And the Zephyr, obviously a shorter car, shorter wheelbase, but a very different looking car and a very attractive car. By today's standards, almost 90 years later, it's a wonderful design, and it was the first successful streamlined car. But as I was saying, there was one more bang left for Edsel, and he in 1939 he looked at the Zephyr and talked to his director of design. By then, Ford had a director of design, Bob Gregory, who joined the company in 1935. And Edsel talked to Bob Gregory about doing something with kind of a continental look that he had picked up in Europe. And the story goes that, Edsel sort of stood over Bob Gregory's shoulder, and Bob Gregory just had a blueprint of a Zephyr, and Edsel kind of channeled himself into Bob, and Bob just created this wonderful, one-of-a-kind car, and they ended up calling it the Lincoln Continental. Edsel took the car to Hobe Sound, Florida, where he had his winter residence. People went nuts over the car. Edsel supposedly came back to Dearborn and said, "I think we could make this part of the Lincoln line." And so they began building it, and they called it the Lincoln Continental. And the rest, as they say, is history. That car is one of the iconic designs of all time, along with cars like the Cord 810 and some others you'll hear about. So that was the end of the big Lincoln era at Lincoln from 1920 to 1939, and now we're going to hear more about some of the other great marks of the classic era.
Great, thank you, David. So we talked earlier about having a definition of luxury, and there really isn't one. But one thing that I'd like to point out is I think it is about prestige. And this was a holdover from the carriage days, because after all, a buckboard would get you to town, but a Brewster Phaeton would also get you to town. On one, you got to town, and the other, you arrived. And so it was about prestige. It was about being seen as driving something different. It was about being separate, about being apart. One of the things that I find intriguing about luxury cars is that they're beautiful, they're comfortable, they're fast, they're complicated, and they were expensive when they were new. These are things that intrigue me. I'm going to talk about 5 specific makes briefly. We can't do an encyclopedic talk. After all, there were 2,000 makes made before World War I, and maybe 7% of them considered themselves to be luxury car builders. So we'd be here till next Old Car Festival if we did that. But I'm going to talk about the 3 Ps of American luxury cars: Packard, Pierce Arrow, and Peerless. I'm fortunate enough to have driven many of the cars we're going to talk about today, although I've never driven a Peerless, but a friend who's here at the show said he just got one, so maybe someday that could happen. But all the cars have different driving characteristics, but they excel in quality, the quality of design, quality of engineering, and quality of execution. So first up is a personal favorite of mine, our own hometown hero, the Packard. Although it had its beginnings in Warren, Ohio. The Packard brothers owned the Packard Electric Company. In 1898, William bought a Winton that gave him nothing but trouble. So he contacted Alexander Winton with some improvement ideas, and Winton supposedly said if he wants to put his own cats and dogs into a motor wagon, he can build it himself. So he did. He went home. They built a car in 1899, which still survives to this day. It's at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. And I saw it run at the Centennial in 1999, which was pretty exciting. Yep. By 1901, they had their famous slogan, which was "Ask the man who owns one." So a potential customer had requested some sales literature, which they didn't have at the ready, and he said, "Ask the man who owns one." So a dear friend of mine who has owned probably 30 or 40 Packards over the years, wife made him business cards that said, "Ask the man who owns 13." So I thought that was great. But Packard got the attention of Detroit investors, Michigan investors, and by 1903 they had moved to Detroit, where they built fine cars until 1956. There were Packards built by Studebaker in 57 and 58, but those came out of South Bend. The first one I'd like to talk a bit about is the 1918 Twin Six. Now, keep in mind, most cars in the world in 1915 were either 4 or 6 cylinders, and Packard decided to up the game and introduce a 12-cylinder car. Now, there's a fine example here at the show today out in the Central Market, a white 7-passenger touring car that's very much a twin to this one. They were magnificent cars, 88 horsepower when a Model T was 20. This came at a price, however. This started at $3,450 in an era where a Ford was $500. So, but you got quite a car for your money. I have driven one. There are some old cars that are great to take around the block. I was ready to go to California. I drove a twin to this one, and it was magnificent. They're heavy, they're solid, they're smooth, they're comfortable. They're magnificent. But keep in mind, Packard built exclusively 12-cylinder cars from 1915 to 1920. They did continue building these into 23. By then, they had introduced a 6-cylinder line. And in those years, they sold 35,000 12-cylinder cars, really cementing their legacy as a fine car maker. We're going to fast forward a bit because we don't want to be here all day. But next is a 31 Packard Deluxe 8. Packard came out with their 8-cylinder line in 1924, which became a hallmark of the mark, and they built them through 1954 in various configurations. But this is, we were talking about custom bodies. Now, this is a batch custom, which means they made a handful. And it is a hallmark of design. It is a Waterhouse convertible Victoria. Now, it looks very sporting like a convertible, but it's a very practical car in that it has a full back seat. Wonderful design. It became adopted as a factory body design later, but this particular car is a Waterhouse. This car cost $5,175 in 1931, and really a beautiful example. And then, to come full circle, Packard reintroduced the 12 in 1932. Initially calling it the Twin Six again, 1933 it was called the 12, in production through August of 1939. They offered both factory and custom body cars. They were wonderful. The initial 12 was 445 cubic inches and would put out about 160, 170 horsepower. This was Packard luxury at its finest. This picture is famed golfer Gene Sorensen, and as my friend David said, that's a lot of golf balls were hit to buy this car. So this is a full custom. This is a Dietrich custom. It costs $5,250. He's pictured here with his wife and Alvin McCauley, the president of Packard. So, they had their ups and downs like all the companies, but they were an independent, unlike Cadillac and Ford that were being subsidized by the parent company. Packard had to go on its own, introduce a line of less expensive cars in 1935, the 120, followed by the 115-6 in 37, kept the company afloat. But by 1940 or 1939, let's say, 10% of the cars or less were the senior cars. 90% were the bread and butter cars that were keeping the door open. Still a fine car, but they did not have the luxury that these automobiles did. The second in the 3 Ps of American luxury cars is the Peerless. That's a Cleveland-based company. They did not start out building cars like the Packard brothers started building electric components. Peerless built clothes ringers. So they were in the clothes wringer business, but when this new technology came out, they decided to get into the foray and came out with a motorette in 1901. And, you know, they, like Henry Ford, had the idea that if we went racing, we would get attention. We race on Sunday, we sell on Monday. It started way back in 1903, 1902. They hired Barney Oldfield, like Henry had done, and they became a success. They sold 1,200 cars by 1906. So think they made like one, and 5 years later they sold 1,200. They decided to get away from the race image and move more towards the luxury side of things. They built a succession of heavy, expensive, large cars. They introduced a V8, a six-cylinder in 1907, a V8 in 1916, and then they had one. Well, let me talk about this. This is the Glidden Tour 1907, and they're getting ready. This was a reliability tour, the first held in 1903 or 4, and went through 1913. But this is a big Peerless getting ready to start the race. And this was a 30 horsepower car that sold for $4,000 in 1907. But they had one more trick up their sleeve. Unfortunately, it never went into production, but it is a magnificent car. This is a 1932 Peerless V16 prototype, and it's one of one made. It was designed by famed designer Franklin Hershey, who had later designed the T-Bird in '55 when he was chief designer at Ford Motor Company, and also designed bodies for Auburn's, Cords, and Duesenbergs. But Murphy was hired to build this prototype. Franklin designed it. It's 16 cylinders, but unlike, say, the big Cadillacs or Marmons, this had more aluminum in its design, and it was a different design. It only weighs around 4,000 pounds despite its size. Unfortunately, only one was made. It does survive. It's in very original condition. I've seen it out running around. It's at the Crawford Museum in Cleveland, and you can see it there. So what happened to Peerless? They did not go out of business. They bought the rights to brew Carling's Black Label beer from Canada because Prohibition was ending, and they thought they could make more money selling beer than they could luxury cars that no one could afford, and they were correct. So the final of the 3 Ps that I'd like to talk about is Pierce Arrow, which was the great masters of luxury cars from Buffalo. Again, the people were in a different business. George N. Pierce Company was making lots of money building bird cages at the time, decided to, again, hop on the bandwagon and build a car, sell a car. They came out also with a motorette, which was a very simple one-cylinder design in 1901. They gained attention for building a high-quality, well-built car, and by 1908, these are 3 great arrows that had been entered in also the Glidden Tour, and all 3 cars not only finished the race, but had a perfect score of 1,000 out of 1,000. So the great arrows these were 60 horsepower cars, and these cost between $8,000 and $12,000 in 1908. We were talking earlier about custom designs. This is one of my personal favorite cars in the entire world. This belonged new to the silent film actor, Fatty Arbuckle. And this is a 66 horsepower Pierce Arrow. What's interesting about Pierce Arrows, they thought, like Rolls-Royce, 6-cylinder was the proper number of cylinders for a luxury car and continued well into the 20s. The 66 was one of the largest production car engines ever made. It's 825 cubic inches in 6 cylinders, producing 66 horsepower. So those pistons were size of paint cans. But what's great about this car, it predicts the future. That is a 1920s looking car in 1919, and it's because it was designed by Harley Earl, who would become department chair of art and color for General Motors, the first organized styling department in the auto industry, and he would shape the future. He was working for Don Lee in Los Angeles, and they designed and built this car. Now, we're talking about cars that cost $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000. This car in 1919 supposedly sold for $31,000, which was all of the money in the world at that time, I believe. But he had just signed a $1 million film contract, and there was no income tax in 1919. So we'll conclude with a Pierce Arrow here, a Model 54 dual cowl Phaeton. I've driven one of these a couple hundred miles in a day, and it was very nice. It was a good drive. But Pierce was trying to provide luxury to everybody at a certain price range, and they couldn't do it. They had two 12s on 3 wheelbases. They had 3 8s on 4 wheelbases. They just had too much going on. Sales were dwindling by 1938. 38, I think 18 cars were assembled from leftover parts, and that was it. But a great make. It's a car I don't want to know too much about because I'd probably have to try to buy one. So I think they're magnificent cars. I'll mention 2 quickly, and then I'll give it over to Bob. Next, we would be remiss without mentioning another Detroit hometown hero, the Cadillac. Cadillac, of course, started in 1903. They exhibited at the Auto Show in New York and got such great attention, they took 2,286 orders for new cars when they said, we can't sell anymore, we're sold out. And then they had to come back and get to work and build some Cadillacs. In 1908, they won the Dewar Trophy for standardization of parts, and they were called at that point the standard of the world. They then went on to introduce electric starting and lights, which transformed transportation. And then in 1930, they threw down the gauntlet in the luxury car world with a 16-cylinder car. 1930 and 31, there was one here yesterday, a 31, but I don't know if it's here today. They sold 5,000 V16s in 30 and 31, spread over 50 different body styles, if you can imagine. Now, as David indicated, Ford was subsidizing Lincoln. Here, GM was subsidizing Cadillac, and they lost money on every one, but it didn't matter. They were winning the prestige war. Next, and finally, I'd like to just mention there were lots of independent companies that were building cars, that were building luxury cars. And here is a Cunningham built in Rochester, New York. They built cars from 1907 to 36. They were the leading dog cart builder in the world, and they built carriages and also hearses, and they were very well known for their coach work. Their chassis were good, their engineering was good, their engines were good, but their coach work was fantastic. This is called a V6, which I don't understand because it has a V8 engine, but it was the Model V6 with the V8, and it was one of the largest, at 442 cubic inches, one of the largest V8s produced until the muscle car era. So, there's a car most people have never heard of, but they built a high-quality luxury car, and they found buyers for a time, and then the world changed. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Bob.
Okay, thank you, David and Matt. I'm going to bring up the rear here, and I'm going to talk about the surprisingly large number of luxury cars made in Indiana. Since my wife and I relocated to Indianapolis about 3 years ago, I guess that's appropriate for me. And I'm going to start with cars made in Indianapolis. And the most famous Indianapolis-built car is the Duesenberg. Even today, some people think the Duesenberg was a German car. And Fred and Augie Duesenberg, who built the car, Fred and Augie were brothers, and they were built in Germany. They were born there, but they came to the U.S. in 1885 with their family. They were really both mechanically talented. They got involved in designing engines. They built enormously successful race cars, and they built their first passenger car in 1922. It was called the Model A. It was the first American luxury car, or first American production car, actually, not just luxury car. First American production car with 4-wheel hydraulic brakes. But the Duesenberg that people remember, the ones they think of when you say the name Duesenberg, is the Model J. This was built at the behest of a man named Erich Laban Cord, a man with an odd name, but we're going to encounter him again. He bought the Duesenberg company in 1926, and he said he wanted to produce the world's finest motor car. And so he had Fred Duesenberg design this magnificent automobile. And the key to Duesenberg's was the engine. This is a 265 horsepower, straight 8, double overhead cam. This is a race-bred engine, as they say. If you wanted a Duesenberg, the rolling chassis would cost you $8,500. And then when you added the custom body, the price could double. They introduced this car in 1929. Not the best time to be introducing a luxury car. It was a magnificent car. It has some of my favorite ads. He drives a Duesenberg. All you got to say. And they weren't sexist. She drives a Duesenberg. Unfortunately, of course, the Depression came along. And between 1929 and 1937, they only made about 480 Model J Duesenbergs. They were bought by people like Clark Gable, Gary Cooper, Dolores Del Rio, another less familiar movie star today, William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper tycoon. He owned a Duesenberg. But like so many other cars, the Great Depression put an end to the Duesenberg in 1937. The second great Indianapolis-built luxury car was the Stutz. Harry C. Stutz was another self-taught mechanic like the Duesenbergs. He was a machinist. He was involved with a variety of automakers and parts companies before he made the first car to bear the Stutz name in 1911. And he wanted publicity for that car. It was intended to be the prototype for a production car, but he wanted publicity. So he entered that car in what was the very first Indianapolis 500 in 1911. He finished 11th, which, doesn't sound that great, but this was not really a race car. And nobody had ever heard of Stutz's before. And he'd garnered enough publicity that it helped him to go ahead and build a production car, and he adopted a slogan. He called the Stutz the car that made good in a day, the day being Memorial Day, 1911. In 1912, Stutz introduced what became its most famous model, which was the Stutz Bearcat, and this was the sports car. This is a 1923 Bearcat. It's in the museum's collection here. Harry Stutz left the company in 1919, went on to form another company called HCS. He used his initials. And gradually the company shifted from the hairy-chested Bearcat emphasis to more luxury. And this is one of the catalogs in the 1920s were just gorgeous from all the car companies. And up here you can see prices for these cars like $5,390. And so a bunch of money, but you got an elegant car with wonderful engineering. Stutz introduced a single overhead cam engine and a double overhead cam engine. Great cars, but, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. There we go. But, of course, the Great Depression comes along, 1929. Stutz takes a hit. 1933, they made 80 cars. 1934, they made 6 cars. 1935, they made 2 cars, and that was the end of the road for Stutz. The third great Indianapolis-built car was the Marmon. Howard Marmon was not a self-taught mechanic. He was unusual among these American auto pioneers because he actually had a college degree. He graduated from the University of California. And he entered in 1899, he joined the family business, which was called Nordyke and Marmon. They made flour milling machinery. In fact, they became the world's largest maker of flour milling machinery. But Howard Marmon, like so many young men in this time, was fired up with enthusiasm about this new technology of horseless carriages. And he pushed Nordyke and Marmon to get into building automobiles, which they finally got into the business in 1905. In 1911, Marmon entered the first Indianapolis 500, did even better than Harry Stutz did because they won it. The first winner was a car called the Marmon Wasp. It's still there at the Speedway Museum today. In 1916, they introduced what would be their longest running model, the Model 34. Again, this is one of the Henry Ford Museum's cars. This had an overhead valve engine, very unusual in 1916 when it was introduced, still unusual in 1921 for that matter. They used an aluminum cylinder block, an aluminum body, and that model stayed in production until 1928. Marmons were owned by people like silent movie stars Francis X. Bushman, Douglas Fairbanks Sr., and the author F. Scott Fitzgerald owned a Marmon. But of course, comes the stock market crash, comes the Depression, Marmon sales collapse. In 1926, they had sold off the flour milling business. Maybe not such a smart move. People still could afford bread. It was luxury cars they couldn't afford. So the stock market comes, and again, like Peerless, Marmon's going to go out with a bang. They introduce, in 1931, a V16. And there was the example of their convertible coupe. Magnificent car, would set you back $5,000, and it was all for naught. And by 1933, Marmon was in receivership. Now, I mentioned the Duesenberg. Can't talk about the Duesenberg without its stablemates, the Auburn and the Cord. Auburns were made in Auburn, Indiana, and for the first 25 years or so, Auburn was a mildly successful maker of mid-price cars. But in 1924, Errit Laban Cord, I told you he was going to come back into the story, he became the general manager. And Errit Laban Cord was a real marketing heavyweight. He was very innovative. He jazzed up the styling of Marmons. He added straight-eight engines. And he eventually, in about a year, he gained control of the whole company. Here's an example of, this is a 1930 Marmon. It's a very elegant car, not as high priced as some of these other cars. Marmon was kind of at the lower end of the luxury market, but they were selling good value. They were selling big straight-eight engines, and they were selling racy styling. Auburn became especially known for a series of very swoopy speedsters, like this 1933. People like silent movie star Tom Mix bought Auburn speedsters, and Auburn became the foundation of a much larger empire for Errit Laban Cord. It's Auburn's success that enabled Cord to buy Duesenberg and build the big Model J Duesenberg. And initially, Auburn seemed to weather the stock market crash because it wasn't as expensive as some of these other cars. They introduced a V12 engine in 1932, but the Depression didn't play favorites, and it couldn't last. And by 1937, Auburn was out of production. But back up a little bit. When E.L. Cord introduced that big Model J Duesenberg in 1929, which was way at the top of the market, he had the Auburns down at the lower end of the luxury market. He wanted to introduce something in between. So in 1929, he launched the L29, and he called it a Cord after himself. You may note that this car looks pretty low for 1929. That's because it's front-wheel drive. So there's no drive shaft running under the floor, so the whole car could be made lower. As I say, it's front-wheel drive. It had a big straight-eight engine, and in front of the straight-eight engine was this very large front-wheel drive mechanism. The result was an extraordinarily long hood, which lent itself to elegant bodies that also allowed you to make those long, sweeping front fenders. And L29 Cords were some of the best-looking cars of the late 1920s. Unfortunately, our old friend the Depression comes along, and by 1931, they're no longer building L29 Cords. But E.L. Cord does not give up easily. And in 1936, he launches a new Cord automobile, And there it is. It is gorgeous, and it is still gorgeous today. Again, it was front-wheel drive. Again, it had an 8-cylinder engine, only this time it's a V8 engine. It's very low because of that front-wheel drive. You'll notice it's got hidden headlights. Even the dashboard is gorgeous. Very innovative car, wonderful car. 1936 is not the time to be introducing this car. 1936 is not the time to be introducing any car. And so they were in production from 36 to 37 and went out of production. The last Hoosier luxury car I'm going to talk about is one that you may not have heard of. And if you've heard of it, you probably haven't seen it because they're really rare. It's called the McFarlane. It was made in Connorsville, Indiana. There's a McFarlane. This is at 1926. McFarlane was a company that was a successful coach builder and got into auto production in 1910. And from the beginning, they were producing high-quality, expensive, low-production cars. Over the life of the McFarlane, average yearly production was 190 cars. And due to this, the very high price and the low production, some people call McFarlane the American Rolls-Royce. And they also had a radiator that kind of copied Rolls-Royce. They were bought by people like band leader Paul Whiteman and heavyweight champion of the world Jack Dempsey, and a heavyweight of another kind. Guy from Chicago, you may have heard of him, named Capone. He bought one for his wife. She liked it so much, he bought one for himself. In 1921, they introduced an amazing engine that they called the Twin Valve 6. It was a 6-cylinder engine. It was a flathead engine, but it had 2 intake valves per cylinder, 2 exhaust valves per cylinder, 3 spark plugs per cylinder. And it was enormous, 573 cubic inches, made 120 horsepower. Unlike these other luxury cars that we've heard about, the Depression did not kill the McFarlane. You might say that McFarlane died of natural causes because by 1928, the owner, Harry McFarlane, was in poor health. And in 1928, the manager of the company, a man named Bert Burroughs, was not only in poor health, he was in poor enough health that he died. And without those two motivating the company declined and it went into bankruptcy. Who should swoop in but our old friend, Eric Laban Cord, who bought McFarlane, not because he wanted to make McFarlanes, but because he wanted a dealer network for that new model J. Duesenberg that he knew was going to be coming from Fred and Augie Duesenberg. So that's our very brief summary of some of the greatest of American luxury cars. We thank you, and we're open to questions if anybody has them. Anybody? Yes?
What, 12? McFarlane's?
McFarlane's.
About 12.
No, there are more than 12.
What?
McFarlane's. How many McFarlane's
Were made.
No. Well, made.
were made? They were
very limited production.
very, very limited. They were made from 1910 to 28, and they made about 190 a year. So you can work the math. Yeah.
Right.
Yes. Yes.
What was the impact of the war, specifically on some of the luxury car, either producers or the consumers? How did the war affect the luxury car?
World War II or World War I? World War I. Well, there was a post-World War I recession that hit Auburn, as an example, pretty hard. Mm-hmm. They introduced a car called the Beauty 6 as a way to spruce it up, but it didn't work. There were some of the earlier ones. Locomobile made it through, right?
No, well, actually, Locomobile went into bankruptcy, and they were bought by Bill Durant,
Okay, so but they continued building for a while.
They continued, but they all were either whatever price range you were in, especially middle and upper income, you were affected greatly. Henry Ford sailed through it, but the middle and upper cars had to either reorganize or go into bankruptcy.
That was the question. So the post-war recession impacted the middle and the luxury.
Oh, yeah.
But Henry Ford was still able to produce and sell despite the recession, the post-war recession.
Well, it even impacted him, as Bob could probably tell you, but he was a little more insulated than small companies like Lexington that made a medium-priced car, but they were one-car company, and so when their sales tapered off 30, 40, 50%, they couldn't survive.
Yeah. And there were cars. There was one of my favorite cars was a car called a Chadwick, which was a wonderful big, fast car. It didn't survive after World War I.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Just one about that black and yellow Cadillac. Is that an original color?
Well, those were expensive enough you could have anything you wanted. So probably not. But I was told yesterday that's actually a 1929 body that was put on a 31 chassis. So it is a Cadillac on that particular car. It is a Cadillac body, but would have been on an 8-cylinder chassis. But by 32, Cadillac had 8s, 12s, and 16s. Can you imagine the range and the sheer numbers of bodies? But like we were talking about the Depression, by 1934, they sold 54 16s that year. And in 30 and 31, they sold 5,000.
I have a Lincoln Confidential Salesman's Handbook, and there were a number of upcharges that you could incur to have your chassis painted body color and things like that. $25. But Matt is right, and people use it for an excuse sometimes to paint some of their cars outrageous colors. But when it came to luxury cars, they certainly weren't all black. There were some real colorful combinations out there that often reflected the personality of the owner, or in some cases, his girlfriend.
Other people? Questions? Well, thank you. Thank you all
Thank
for
you very
coming.
much.
Thank you.
It's been fun.
Bye-bye.
Yep.